Okay, in this lecture on value, utility, and price, I want to start by emphasizing a few things that Dr. Holtzman mentioned in his lecture last night. And the first thing is that as the Austrians conceive economics, economics begins with what is inside of us. It begins by reflective knowledge of what we know about human action because we are in fact human beings. And then from that beginning knowledge, it emanates outward to, let's say, empirical facts about human action like prices of things and patterns of production and business cycles and so on and so forth. And this process, as Dr. Holtzman mentioned, is all logically integrated. And so we begin with the fundamental principles, sort of reflective knowledge. We kind of unpack the meaning of human action, starting from these basic concepts, to see what is universally true about any and all action, what meaning we bring to it as human beings. And then we proceed to the more sophisticated, more complicated, more difficult aspects of human action, exchange and monetary prices, and, as I mentioned, patterns of production, and so on and so forth. But the key thing to keep in mind is it all has to be integrated, right? When we go to the higher, more complicated levels, it must be logically built upon the simple, more basic levels. This, again, you see lots of similarities, perhaps, especially in this lecture, of what you might have seen in other mainstream economics courses, demand and supply curves and determination of prices and so on and so forth. But a key aspect that distinguishes this Mengerian approach from the mainstream is this connectedness, this integration. We'll see that the mainstream is in fact disconnected and has tremendous difficulty in making any sort of reasonable connection between their theories of price and production patterns and so on and so forth, and this kind of basic meaning that we attach to human action. And by the way, we'll talk more about that particular problem in the lecture on Wednesday, where we talk about further points in value theory and utility and so on. Okay, so the main thrust of this lecture then is just to show this connection, right? We're going to start and just talk about these basic principles of value, and then show the connection logically between these basic principles of value and prices on the market. So we'll start with where Professor Salerno just left off, with ends and means, and simply say at the beginning that we can define a human action as Murray Rothbard does, as purposeful behavior. And as Dr. Holtzman pointed out, purpose is something that we don't empirically observe in action. Purpose is inside of us. It's in our minds. It's something we bring to action. It's the meaning we give to it. So we have a purpose. We have a motive. We have an end that we wish to attain. And to attain this end, we apply a means. And as Professor Salerno pointed out, it was Menger who explained this connection between ends and means. What is a means? What is a good? And how is it connected to our to the achievement of our ends? Okay, so from this point, we simply move directly on to some of the these basic foundational principles of value. And let's begin with this this fact. And again, here we're just unpacking the basic meaning of action. We're thinking reflectively about what it means to act and some of these basic concepts that are built into human nature, we might say. And one of these is that, and again, Rothbard emphasizes this, one of these is that only individual persons act. So individual human beings are the agent of acting. There is no collective acting entity. And therefore, we cannot, when we start to talk about social valuing of things, where individual people value things in the social setting, we cannot presume a collective entity of valuing and acting. This would be inappropriate. We would not be able to logically derive this from what we know the nature of action is. action is of the individual person. So when we go to talking about valuing things in the division of labor, where we're all producing for the consumptive ends of other people and having, therefore, if we're to economize, having to assess the valuations that other people are making in their minds to ensure that our productive activities are achieving something of a greater value, we have to explain this by coming up with, there has to be some process by which we can come up with a reasonable, objective assessment of what other people value. We can't just say, oh, society values this, such and such, and proceed on the fiction of some kind of collective evaluation. Now, another basic principle stems directly, Professor Salerno mentioned this, stems directly from the idea of scarcity. So scarcity, we know, is a fundamental principle of action, because if things, as he pointed out, if things are not scarce, if everything exists in superabundance, then, well, we don't need to act, right? We can engage in lots of activity, but we don't need to act, because under those conditions, we wouldn't be choosing. We wouldn't be valuing one thing relative to another, choosing the value of one thing, setting aside the value of another. We understand that this is part of action. We just contemplate our own action, and we see that choice is imposed upon us, so to speak, or is part of action because of the scarcity of things. So scarcity is fundamental principle of human existence. Despite what politicians say, it can't be overcome by any kind of subsidies or programs or institutional arrangements. The degree of scarcity of things can obviously change, but the fundamental existence of scarcity is bound up in the way things exist. Okay, so in every action we have to choose. Because of scarcity, we have more ends that we could pursue with a given means, that we have. And therefore, when we act, we're choosing from among the competing ends. And the question is, well, how do we choose? And the answer we've already seen is we choose according to our purposes. Now, to have a name to refer to this, we call this valuation, or Ludwig von Mises calls this valuation. So we value the different courses of action that we could take with a given means. And we then compare the value of different courses of action. And we choose accordingly. So we choose that course of action with a given means that we prefer, as we say. So we come to this basic concept in economics of preference. Preference is the basis of choice in action. And preference is simply a comparison of the value of different courses of action. So we always choose in accordance with what we value more or what we prefer. Notice that in order to choose, all we need to be able to say in our minds is one course of action is better and another is not as good. All we have to do is establish a rank order of value. We do not, as Professor Salerno mentioned, we do not need to assign cardinal numbers. We do not need to treat or assume that the value is a substance in order to choose. We just have to say, this is better, and this other alternative is not as good to me, and therefore I choose the better alternative. This is the idea of preference. It's an ordinal rank. Now notice again, if value is an ordinal rank, if we demonstrated this just from our reflective knowledge about acting, then to certain things follow from this, right? To certain logical possibilities are ruled out by the ordinality of preferences. But before we go to those, let's just mention a few other things about preference. Preference exists in action. Preference is part of our action. Preference is bound up in action. Preference, as we said before, is just the valuing by which we choose and therefore act. So we cannot conceive of preference as separate from action. This, again, is sometimes done by the mainstream. Paul Samuelson famously postulated the idea of revealed preference, where we have some sort of preference ordering on, that we could put out on a blackboard or something, and then we must, over time, act in accordance with this scale of values. That's not what Austrians mean by preference. A preference is not separate from action. It's not that we sit down on Monday and we write out a bunch of things that we're going to do during the week and then we're forced on Wednesday to do that regardless of how we're valuing things on Wednesday. No. Preference is just what we're valuing in our minds when we choose and act. So it's bound up in our action. And for this reason, Rothbard points out that our preferences are demonstrated by our action. Joe Salerno mentioned this, right? You're all here, and so you're demonstrating that you're preferring this particular end to other alternatives that you might be pursuing with your labor and so on. So this is the key to how we know something about other people's preferences. Other people will demonstrate their preferences to us by their action. So entrepreneurs in the market then can obviously know something about our preferences as consumers when they see the pattern of our demands. And this is the manner in which, or at least the necessary condition by which, these entrepreneurs are able to economize their production decisions, achieving higher valued as opposed to lesser valued production processes. Okay, then we want to add two more points really about value itself, and these have been touched upon, but we can elaborate a bit. One is the subjectivity of value. Now, what Menger and the Austrians mean by the subjectivity of value is just that value is in our minds. Value exists only in our minds. It's a state of mind. And therefore, it has no extensive property. Nothing about value exists outside of our mind. And if it lacks an extensive property, then it obviously is not subject to any measurement, because we cannot define a unit of subjective value. And again, as Joe pointed out, if I say I get a util of satisfaction from delivering this lecture, then this is just a nonsense statement, because you cannot understand objectively what a util of value would be to me. Why? Because I can't take it outside of my mind so that you can experience it in some objective way. There's no objective property that you can experience yourself and say, like there would be, let's say, with a foot or a mile, where we can both objectively see it because it exists outside of our minds and agree that this distance is a foot. That distance is a mile, or this color is blue and that color is red, and so on. So this is what Austrians mean by the subjectivity of value. And the implications, again, are that value is not subject to measurement. So there are no units of value. Therefore, there are no arithmetic operations that we can perform with value. Right? That follows directly. We cannot add up value. We cannot subtract one value from another. We cannot interpersonally compare value from one person to another, because we don't have a common unit in which our different values could be put. These are the implications of the subjectivity of value. And you see again that the mainstream is sort of ambivalent about this, right? They kind of want to have their subjective cake and they want to eat the cardinal cake too. They want to have it both ways, right? They like the idea. These basic ideas about human action are so powerful and ingrained in us that it's difficult, even if you want a mathematical system of economics, to forego them completely, right? It's sort of difficult to say, well, we just don't need to say anything at all about valuing things or about preferring or so on and so forth. We sort of, even in the mainstream, have to kind of grapple with this difficulty of how do you reconcile the subjectivity of value with an objective treatment of value, like a utility function. And again, we'll take up these questions in more detail on Wednesday. And the other thing I want to mention about value, this I don't think has been mentioned yet, something else that we find reflectively by thinking about our action, is that value is not constant. Now, this is a different idea, is a different concept. This doesn't have anything to do with the subjectivity of value. This is a different principle about value. The subjectivity of value only has to do with the fact that value is a product of our mind only. What we mean by the lack of constancy in value is that there isn't a constant quantitative relationship between external factors in the world that affect our action and the action itself.